Hi, I'm Sarah Broom, and I'm in Harlem. I wrote The Yellow House to answer what is at once a basic but also existential question about who belongs, whose stories get told. I wanted to speak into a void in the literature. I wondered why the stories of me and my family and my 50 nieces and nephews didn't exist in the oft told narrative of New Orleans. I wanted to make a book that was the beginning of an answer to a question about how our lives mattered and how we deserve to also be on the American map and in the city story of itself. This book is not only a book about a house that I lived in and that I loved, and that in certain ways remains a part of me, but it's really an attempt to think about what it actually means to belong to a place, what it means to feel that you have somehow come from a place that has shaped you and made you into the person you are. For me, American ingenuity, I understand this, I think deeply because I come from the city where jazz was born. And so, what jazz teaches us is that we pull from all the disparate pieces of the world, of the things inside of us and the things beyond us. And from that pulling, we can try to make something new. We can try to make a new tapestry. And for me, that was the work of this book, was to, in the way that Romare Bearden made his collage, to actually pull from all the disparate elements, to think not only about how, for instance, to use journalism, but how to use anthropology and ethnography, how to use oral history, how to go in the archive and pull from history and use all of those pieces, the sounds of people's voices, the rhythm of their voices, the city itself and the qualities of the place to try and make a work. And so memory, I think, is one thing, but I think it's also important to go beyond the things we remember, to inquire about other people's memories, to fact check our memory, because memory can lie, actually. And so for me, that really was the work. A few examples of the way in which I thought about memory and interrogating memory in a way is in how I was thinking about my family history. All of us who are from families understand that over time we build family lore. And these stories, for instance, are told over and over and over again. And throughout generations, we often accept these stories for what they are. And so my work was not just to be in relation to my family as, the youngest, in my case, of 12 children, but to interrogate the stories I had been told from birth, the stories about my own origins, the stories about why I was named what I was named, the stories that even I began to develop. There's one particular story about my childhood friend Alvin, who died when we were quite young, under 20. And I had created for myself this story about Alvin's death, where exactly he died, what the circumstances of his death were, because the truth was actually really hard. It was much harder than the story I had made for myself. And in going back in the archives and the microfiche, looking up the newspaper stories about his death, interviewing people about his death, I realized that the truth was a lot more brutal than I myself wanted to admit. The thing that we all have to learn, I think, from history is that it is a made, composed thing. And it's important to always ask the question, who is doing the composing? And, part of it, I think, is to look back with courage and with bravery and to think about context, what informs our present time, what actually happened, because that is indeed the bedrock for how we grow. And, this story that I was telling, for this story that I was telling, bedrock was really an important thing because I thought so much about the ground itself that our house was sitting on. I thought about the stability of it, the structure of the foundation. And the thing that I understood very quickly, even perhaps as a child, was that the foundation matters. It's everything. And history is that way too. We have to look on it. There's this wonderful quotation from John Berger, and he says, "To look is an act of choice." And I completely agree. Houses are important because they create in us, I think, from a very young time, a sense of structure for our lives. We can grow to feel so much a part of a house. And I think so much about the way in which a house is an apt metaphor for so much of our lives. A house uh, being a metaphor for, the self, being a way to also examine the house of the self and interiority. And I couldn't have asked for a better structure really for this particular book, because the house, houses have architecture and so do books. And the house gave me a way of framing a space, of creating a kind of tactile world, of thinking about the impact of a room and of an object, and how those things can actually inform our interior worlds and make people of us. And so houses to this day remain so important for me. I'm thinking so much these days about all of us who are in this together and what it means to be in our respective places and how much we can read from those places. When you look out the window, what your view is telling you something about your lot in life. And that's something that is deeply important to me and is not lost on me. And then also the ways in which a home, whether you own the home or rent the home, creates a kind of space where we can unfold ourselves and either be comfortable or not comfortable. The feeling of belonging to a city like New Orleans is, I think, something that we all understand on some level, because it's not that different in certain ways from what it means to also be American and to belong to this place. I think one of the things that interests me is what happens when a city is mythologized and also deeply beloved, as New Orleans is. What happens to the people who help make the stories of the place? And what kinds of stories are told to the exclusion of others? And so this complication of the story of a place, one of the things I understood many years later when I was outside of New Orleans were the ways in which I allowed the city to stand in for me, to speak for me, to in a way become me, that I could somehow explain myself by saying I'm from New Orleans. And so I really wanted to think about our connection to place and also honor what's very real for many of us about our connection to a certain spot of land, our connection to a city, understanding too that places have personalities and places make us and ground us, and they give us a certain vantage point. In my position and where I'm from, where we were situated, cut off in a way from the rest of the street, cut off from the rest of the city. I believe that gave me a certain vantage point that no other positioning ever could. Well, on the matter of memory and then also reason and logic being so important, I think it's a really complicated thing because so much of memory is in fact tied to reason and logic, which is how it becomes easy to believe the memory wholeheartedly, right? And what I'm interested in though is how we collect memory sometimes in order to sort of avoid another reality, right? Another hard place where we might go. And, part of my own training as a journalist tells me that memory is important. It's the beginning, it's the opening of the door. It gets us facing in a certain direction. But part of, I think, the way in which I wanted to complicate my own work was not just to remember, not just to say, I think this happened, but I can't remember, but to actually go back into the archive, to do reporting, to interrogate the memory, to tear the memory apart in a way and say, what is the thing that I was building, right, in this memory, or that someone else was building, and what was the truth of the matter? And I think, memories contain a kind of essence, a kernel of truth, something that is really important. And memory isn't always wrong or even off, but I do feel that there is something to going beyond the thing you remember and stacking it with everything you can find, evidence, and thinking about. I mean, this is interesting from my perspective because my grandmother, who was really important to me in New Orleans, had Alzheimer's at the end of her life. And so there was so much that she didn't remember. And so when memory is in any way compromised, what more exists and where else can we go was the question I was asking. So I grew up in this very colorful house where stories were revered and storytelling was a sort of sport, And so you have to imagine a house with 12 or 13 people and they're all telling variations of the same story. They're talking loud, they're talking over each other. And in an effort to find a place to exist in this world, the thing that I would do is go in the room where these stories were happening, and I would hide in closets or under the table. And often I would simply try to remember every single word that was being said. And sometimes secrets were being said, or people were telling stories that they didn't want the other person to know. And so I would essentially record these things in my mind and then run off and find the exact person about who the story was about. And I would essentially tell them. And in this way, I gained the name tape recorder, which was a thing I didn't remember, but is a great example of the way in which my family really told me the story of myself and really helped me in so many ways to understand who I was and my own compulsions. I think a lot about the day when I went to kindergarten for the first time. And before that moment, I had been called Monique, which is my middle name. And my mother turned to me. We were in the parking lot of the school. And she says, when those people ask your name, tell them Sarah. And I thought, Sarah, who is Sarah? And I essentially started going by this name in school, and it created this real duality in me. There was the Sarah person who people called when I was sort of out in public. And within that name, which contained so much, was so much distance. And then there was my middle name, Monique, and Mo, which is what my family called me. And, I came at some point to understand that there were these many selves. And perhaps this was a very useful story, being a kid a Black woman in America. It was perhaps useful, but to this day, the story of that naming, of how I was named, and thinking about who in my life knows which name to call has been a kind of recurring theme. So I'm thankful for that memory of my mother who helped me remember. I hope that readers learn from this work the dynamism of absence. That, for me, I can never ever look upon any landscape the same way. When I drive by a place and it's being demolished and something else is going up in its stead, I always think of the stories that house could tell. I think of the families who lived in that house. I think of the memories, the joy, our human connection to place and to land, and how that connection is such a vital thing that I think matters deeply to all of us. And so, places matter and people matter, and we have to be, I think, careful about the known maps and who they leave off. And we have to remember that even on the edges of the map, uh, that there are stories, there are people whose lives matter. I think writers exist for these moments where we have to take the detritus. In my case, it's the demolished house. We have to take what's left of something, or even what's no longer there, and we try to make something of it. And so for me, the toll, or the question, the thing that was agitating me was, how can I use words? How could I resurrect a house with words? And suddenly words felt really paltry, like inadequate tools. And I think that, going back, that revisiting, James Baldwin has this wonderful line: I returned here because I was afraid to. And I think for me, that was the cost to of facing my fear and all the things I didn't want to know, but that I ultimately knew had to be dealt with and faced.